call the committee to order. This is the 58th meeting of the Subcommittee of International Human Rights of the Standing Committee of the Foreign Affairs and International Development Committee, and we're doing a study on the human rights situation in Iran. We have three guests with us today. Just before we start to accept your testimony, gentlemen, we have two motions to deal with, get a little of our other work done as well. And I understand Mr. Hsu has a motion.
Oops. Thank you, Chair. Yes, I just wanted to move the motion of Mr. Cotler from Monday, February 23rd, regarding the Burmese women who work for community-based organizations.
Members have a copy of this, and we discussed it earlier. Any discussion? Have we have consensus? We do. Thank you. Mr. Benskin.
Yes. Everybody has a copy of the motion as this motion as well. In short, it is a motion to move forward with a brief study on the human rights situation in Vietnam, given some of the changes that are happening there currently.
Everybody has a copy of this. Do we have consensus on this? Yes, the edit has been taken out in each copy. Okay, thank you very much. So now we're able to move to the testimony of our guests. And do we have a budget matter? No, we don't. Okay, thank you, Mr. Sweet. So we have guests with us today, and I would ask you, if I discussed a moment ago with Mr. Matas, that to keep your remarks reasonably brief, which leaves a little more time for the members to ask those pertinent questions to this. So if you'd like to introduce yourselves, and who is going first? Mr. That's what I thought. I'll turn it over to you. And if you could say your affiliation as well, so the people watching will know.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, honorable members of the committee. My name is Michael Mostyn, and I am the CEO of Brith, Canada, a human rights organization that has been serving this country and both the Jewish and broader Canadian communities for 140 years. As the holiday of Purim approaches, we are reminded of the Book of Esther and its recounting of a Persian king named Ahasuerus, whose newly appointed chief minister, Haman, plots to kill not just Mordecai, a Jew who had found his disfavor, but the entire Jewish population. Haman surreptitiously obtains Ahasuerus' permission, and state funds execute his plan, and it is only thanks to the bravery of a Jewish heroine named Esther and her uncle Mordecai that Haman's evil plot to destroy the Jewish people is stopped. Just like in the times of Mordecai and Esther, a Persian leader has arisen who has repeatedly called for the annihilation of the Jewish state and has activated the terrorist proxies of Iran to murder innocent Jews all around the globe in premeditated acts of terror. The Ayatollah, Iran's ultimate decision maker and modern-day equivalent of Haman, is at the helm of the world's premier state sponsor of terror and a regime that has continuously violated even the most basic of human rights. My colleagues David Matas and Yehuda Azoulay will now elaborate further upon the historical and current anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism central to the regime of the mullahs of Iran.
Thank you very much. My name is Yehuda Azoulay, founder of Sephardic Legacy Institute. Thank you very much, honorable members of the subcommittee. I'm privileged to appear before you today to discuss and share my expertise with you pertaining to the history of the Jews in Iran and the regional experience of Jewish refugees. Iranian Jews are amongst the oldest inhabitants of the country. The beginnings of Jewish history in Iran date back to the late biblical times. The biblical books of Isaiah, Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah contain references to the life and experiences of Jews in Persia. Persian Jews have lived in these territories for 2,700 years. Martin Gilbert, a famous historian, mentioned in his book, In Ishmael's House, A History of Jews in Muslim Lands, and he says the following: when the king of Persia, Cyrus the Great, defeated the Babylonians in 539 BCE, he liberated the Jews of Jerusalem. Some of the freed slaves who were no longer forced to worship idols began to rebuild their temple, which has been destroyed 42 years after the prophet Jeremiah's prediction. Others went eastward to settle in Persia. Among their descendants 100 years later were Esther and her cousin Mordecai. Her forestalled and the attempt by the Grand Vizier Haman to exterminate the entire Persian community, Jewish community. The story and the holiday of Purim, which is celebrated next week by Jews around the world, is a continuous narrative throughout the course of Jewish history. Later in history, Persian Jews were among those who wrote the Babylonian Talmud, and a crucial source of Jewish theology and law to this very day. The period of Iranian Jewry include Assyrian exile of the Northern Kingdom, Persian Jewry under Cyrus the Great, the Second Temple period, the Parthian period, Sassanid period, early Islamic period, Mongol rule, and Safavid Qajar dynasties. In the middle of the 19th century, J.J. Benjamin wrote about the life of the Persian Jews. They are obliged to live in a separate part of town, for they are considered as unclean creatures. During the Pahlavian dynasty, an important factor in economic improvement of the Jews was close relations between the Shah and the State of Israel. Details of this connection and how the condition of Iranian Jews improved dramatically in a few short years. During the Islamic Republic, since 1979, at the time of the establishment of the State of Israel, in 1948, there were approximately 100,000 to 120,000 Jews living in Iran, this historical center of Persian Jewry. This estimate is based on the Jewish Agency, which had an office in Tehran in 1948. Approximately 95% has since migrated. The current Jewish population of Iran today is roughly 8,000 Jews. The Islamic Republic uses factions which the Iranian Jewish community, to win public relations, point with the Western world, points within the Western world. But privately, many Jews complain to foreign reporters of discrimination. The strong public anti-Israel positions of Iranian Jews is a reflection of the pressure of them from the authorities and their desire for survival. Iranian leadership claims Jewish minority treated fairly, but experts, rabbis, offering contrasting views. Their basic fear, according to researchers. The current Ayatollah Khomeini has been clear in declaring his goal, the annihilation of the State of Israel. Annihilation of Israel is an annihilation, essentially, of the Jewish people. Furthermore, the Iranian support for Hamas and Hezbollah is well documented, and how they both use the Palestinian narrative as the only refugee status from the region is a complete misconception. In the years leading up to the declaration of the State of Israel and immediately following it, many Iranian Jews were forced to leave their homes. What follows is their largely untold story. While the UN endorsed the establishment of the State of Israel, the majority of Israel's neighboring Arab countries never recognized its legitimacy. The story of the Middle East conflict seems to be an everlasting one. Certainly, the history of Sephardic and Iranian Jewry is a traumatic experience during the 1940s and has been sorely neglected. Following the UN resolution of 1947, which suggested dividing Palestine into two countries, Palestine and Israel, the situation continued to deteriorate. The Arabs refused to accept the UN recommendation, and when Israel declared the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, 7 armies from Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Libya, and Saudi Arabia attacked Israel. Moreover, the native Muslim countries' persecution of Jews became rampant. Muslims around the world directed their hostility to the Jewish state against the Jewish communities living in their midst. In some places, public executions became more and more frequent as the Arab-Israeli conflict developed. Arab governments also turned on their Jewish population. These governments often instituted drastically anti-Jewish measures, such as confiscation of passports, freezing of bank accounts, arbitrary arrests, and summary executions, making life unbearable for local Jews. Their homes and other properties were among often those that were confiscated. When they were not, they still had to be left behind, since Jews were rarely allowed to sell them, and when they did, at ridiculously low prices. This necessary flight, which very few of their possessions also led to the abandonment of ancient synagogues, community centers, schools, hospitals, and once thriving businesses. Perhaps most painful for the Jews was living behind the cemeteries where their ancestors had been buried for thousands of years, and on which the gravestones were vandalized and used built on homes, parks, hotels, and public transports. Thus, while many Arabs left Palestine following the declaration of the Jewish state, many Jews left their homes in Afghanistan, Algeria, Bukhara, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, Syria, Turkey, Tunisia, and Yemen. These refugees suffered a threefold loss: the loss of their identity, their way of life, which simply ceased to exist, and their material possessions. 3,000-year-old Jewish communities were destroyed. Nearly 1 million Jews in Arab lands lost their homes. These Jews are refugees as surely as Palestinians. Jewish refugees from Arab lands sustained incredible losses in a single generation. The financial losses were in the billions. but beyond that, irreparable. Damage was done to an entire civilization. Ancient Jewish communities, which could trace their history back to 3,000 years, were no more. The destruction of their civilization is a story that has yet to properly be told. This testimony pertaining to the history of the Jews in Iran and the regional experience of Jewish refugees is a step towards that direction. Thank you.
Mr. Matas.
Thank you. When the subject matter is international human rights violations and Iran, we have regrettably a wide range of subjects we can discuss. Today we are focusing on Iranian anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, not just because we represent B'nai Brith. We do so because anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are central to the regime of the mullahs of Iran. Though the regime bills itself as Islamic and Shiite, it is more accurate to describe it as anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic. There are many different ideological strands to the anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism of the regime, and here I'll mention only 5. First of all, Holocaust denial. Now, under President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, there was vociferous Holocaust denial, and there was one Holocaust denial conference in December 2006, another one scheduled for December 2013. The new president, Hassan Rouhani, initially canceled that 2013 conference, but then he reinstated it, and it took place last year in October 2014. Secondly, Iran rejects any possible peace agreement between the Palestinians and Israel. Their attitude is Israel should not exist, whether the Palestinians accept its existence or not. President Rouhani has said that Israel is an old wound that should be removed. Third, there's the mistreatment and expulsion of its own Jewish population, which we heard about from Yehuda Azoulay. The Jewish population of Iran in 1948, according to the Jewish Agency, was 100,000 to 120,000. In 2011, according to an Iranian census, it was less than 9,000, and it's presumably decreased since then. And we have seen Jews in Iran, including Jewish community leaders, arbitrarily executed, accused and convicted of spying for Israel, and their property confiscated. And they've been forced to condemn Israel publicly and take part in anti-Israel demonstrations. Fourth, there's the installation or the foundation of Hezbollah, which began in Iran in 1982 as part of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. The Iranian regime sent fighters from Iran to Lebanon at the end of 1983. These fighters constituted the initial core of Hezbollah. And I'm pleased to see that Canada has listed both the Hezbollah and this Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as terrorist organizations. And finally, in this short list, there's the attack by Iran against the Jewish communities worldwide, not just against Israel, but the diaspora. So we saw in 1992 an attack in the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, and in 1994 an attack against the Jewish community organization in Buenos Aires, killing 85 and wounding over 200. The Argentinian prosecutor in these murders, Alberto Nisman, was murdered in Buenos Aires just last month in January. In July 2012, Hezbollah operatives killed 5 Israeli tourists and wounded 32 others. One of the 2 attackers was a Canadian citizen, Hassan El-Hajj Hassan. So I wanted to mention in response to those 5 points in the general anti-Semitic drift of the regime, the essence of the regime, 6 possible recommendations. One is to expand exceptions to the state immunity legislation to allow for Iran to be sued for international human rights violations. It's now designated under the Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act, so it can be sued for acts of terrorism, but its international violations go beyond terrorism, and I would suggest we need an expansion. Secondly, I suggest we ask Lebanon for the extradition of the Bulgarian bomber, the Canadian citizen Bulgarian bomber, Hassan El-Hajj Hassan. Third, I suggest we direct our concerns to the ongoing negotiations about nuclear weapons in Iran. Any regime hell-bent on the destruction of Israel and the Jews should be kept as far away from weapons of mass destruction as possible. And I endorse the recommendation previously made to this committee that if there is some sort of agreement between Iran and other states about nuclear weapons capability, it should include some human rights component, as there used to exist in the Helsinki Accord. Fourth, I'm pleased to see that the European Union belatedly, in July 2013, in response to the Bulgarian attack, listed the military wing of Hezbollah in its list of terrorist entities. But this division between military and civilian wings doesn't really make any practical sense, since there's no division in funding or responsibility. And I would ask Canada to ask the EU to list all of Hezbollah as terrorists. Fifth, there is the United Nations General Assembly every year resolution on Iran, which Canada is the lead sponsor, and it has some language condemning harassment against Jews and persecution of Jews, but it doesn't mention either anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism, and I suggest the language should be strengthened. Sixth and finally, I'm pleased to see that the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs has recommended that the government encourage the negotiating parties to take into account all refugee populations as part of any just and comprehensive resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian and Arab-Israeli conflicts. And I like the recommendation, but I must express some reservation about the government response to it, which says that it would relate only to later stage negotiations and not to negotiations with the Palestinians. We suggest that this type of principle, that there are two refugee populations, is central to the first stage peace negotiations. We cannot see our way through to peace without breaking the chains of anti-Zionism holding Palestinian refugees down. We do that by confronting the myth of one refugee population with the reality of two refugee populations. We do that by confronting the myth that Israel is a Western imperial colonial enterprise, a myth which holds particular sway with the mullahs of Iran, with the reality that Israel is in large measure composed of Jews from the Middle East, including Iran. Unless the Palestinians themselves accept the reality of dual victimization, a meaningful peace becomes impossible. I'll stop there, and we'll leave it for questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Matas. We've got time, I believe, for 7-minute rounds, which we'll leave a little bit at the end. I understand Mr. Cotler may have a motion that he wants to move at the end. So we'll start off with Mr. Sweet.
Thank you very much, Chair, and welcome to all of our witnesses. And I just want to express our deep concern about what happened recently in Montreal. I think you're probably well aware that we had a take note debate in the House 2 nights ago in regards to anti-Semitism, and those concerns were expressed by many colleagues in the House, and so just want to express them once more. Also, I hope that the message of Purim and the biblical story that your testimony here today is akin to Mordecai's words at such a time as this, that you're here. So I would like to begin with asking if you think that the situation in Iran vis-a-vis human rights, and I would say human rights for anyone in Iran, average Iranians, Jews who are in Iran, Baha'i, Christians, whether that has improved at all under Rouhani's rule?
My perception is no. I think what we've seen is a change in vocabulary without a change in behavior. The Rochefoucauld said, hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. And I think what we're seeing now is a different language, but we're seeing the same level of human rights violations without any real abatement. And I think some of the instances that I mentioned illustrate that hypocrisy, that Rouhani canceled Ahmadinejad's Holocaust denial conference and then had another one, had his own a year later. And there's a whole pattern like that in terms of the Palestinian-Israeli peace negotiations. He said whatever the Palestinians would accept, we would accept. But then he said Israel's an old wound that has to be removed. So instead of speaking unequivocally, he's speaking out of both sides of his mouth. But if you look at the number of people in jail, the number of people executed, the problems that Iran is posing to its opposition, including the Jewish community, I don't see any movement. I mean, we do have these Interpol arrest warrants from Argentina. I don't see Iran cooperating with those arrest warrants. So I think the problem remains what it was. I mean, hypocrisy, I suppose, initially poses a problem because is he telling the truth? We have to give him some time to evaluate. But I think the regime under Rouhani has gone on long enough that we can make that evaluation and call him to account for the regime's deeds rather than just for what he's been saying.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think we've been strung along enough in this regard. I believe it was a Foreign Affairs Committee, but there was some study done in regards to the entire population of Jews who were expelled from Arab countries, and I believe that number, because you were mentioning the number from just Iran, but I believe the total number is around 800,000. Is that correct?
Yes, I think it's 800,000 from Arab countries, and the Iran, which is Muslim but not Arab, is in addition. So if you add up the Arab numbers, it's another 100,000. We're getting close to 1 million. So the numbers are huge. And in fact, there were more people displaced from the initial 1948 wars, Jews from Arab countries and Iran, than there were Palestinian refugees. The manner in which the two refugee populations have been treated is something that has to be constantly kept in mind when we deal with these peace negotiations.
What effect have the sanctions against Iran had so far in regards to specifically human rights concerns?
Well, if you look at this overall statistics, not good. Some cases there's some movement in some individual cases. And the sanctions, unfortunately, as I say, we've got a wide menu of agenda items to pursue in dealing with human rights violations in Iran. And what's taken the priority, perhaps understandably, is the development of the nuclear weapons capability of Iran. And my own view is that the sanctions have had an impact in bringing Iran to the negotiating table and perhaps slowing up the development of the nuclear weapons capability. But to a certain extent, there's been a trade-off in the international community between human rights and the nuclear weapons capability, and the focus has been on the nuclear weapons capability. And as a result, they're not prepared to accelerate the sanctions or to pin them directly to human rights. They've been pinning them more directly to the development of the nuclear weapons capability. And the sanctions, I would say, have been useful. I note Mr. Cotler has a private members bill that deals specifically with reporting on sanctions, and which is I draw to your attention. But the sanctions have been useful, but they're only one weapon in an armory of combating human rights violations, and I don't think that we can rely on them alone.
In fact, to a degree, the Iranian regime has been able to hide behind the attention that has been drawn to the nuclear program and continue to actually have an increased amount of executions in their prisons while all of this is going on. And unfortunately, one of the challenges that we have is the Western media doesn't report on this very much.
Well, of course, this is a constant problem. I mean, we did have a Canadian reporter who was killed there, Kazemi, and it's much more difficult for reporters to access violations where the reporters are personally risking their lives to do so. It's a lot easier to report on situations in Israel where there's a free media than there is in Iran. What we have to do in these sorts of situations is rely on information however we get it, and not just on the media.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sweet. Mr. Benskin, please.
Thank you, and welcome, and thank you for your testimony. This is a huge and ongoing issue. Mr. Azoulay you had briefly touched on a few thousand years of history in the matter of moments of an issue that still is very very poignant today. And as my colleague Mr. Sweet pointed out, we 2 nights ago, we had a take note debate on the issue of anti-Semitism, and unfortunately, in my hometown, there was an incident in the Côte Saint Luc area, NDG area, of anti-Semitic acts. So it's an issue which is steeped in history, and issues that are steeped in history, as we've seen throughout history, are very, very hard issues to tackle. In Iran, there's a population of, you said there was 8,000 Jews who are still in Iran. First off, just for my own edification, have they chosen to stay in Iran because of the fact that they are Iranian or their history is Iranian, or are they being prevented from leaving, or is there a travel ban that's preventing them from leaving?
Well, I mean, they can't actually go to Israel because there's exit controls in Iran, and the Iranians wouldn't let them go to Israel. They could potentially go to another country, and then from another country go to Israel. But they'd have to disguise their intention. They don't. As far as Iran officially exists, the official position of Iran is Israel does not exist. They won't even use the name Israel. They call it the Zionist entity. I mean, even at the UN, I was there once at the UN debate where they kept on calling it the Zionist entity instead of Israel, and the chair said, no, you've got to call it by its proper name. So for them, Israel doesn't exist, and anything that the state has to do that would officially encompass the recognition of Israel doesn't happen. Now, for the Jews, I mean, you see this, like there's even a few Jews left in Afghanistan. I mean, sometimes people are so tied up with their, and of course, I mean, we saw this during the Holocaust, that some Jews would stay even with the advent of Nazism. That some Jews, they hope for the best, they have community ties, they're prepared to go along. There is a price to be paid. I mean, this gets back to the hypocrisy of the regime. If you look at the Constitution of Iran, it protects Jewish religious rights. But as long as they're prepared, and you know, obviously the large majority of them weren't prepared to do so, but as long as they're prepared to denounce Israel, reject Zionism, then they can kind of lead their lives. So I guess it's a choice made in a coercive environment. Most of them have chosen not to make that choice, but a small minority have remained behind. They're in a difficult situation, and I mean, I remember it was a few years ago, about a dozen of them were being prosecuted for being spies for Israel. I mean, it was trumped-up charges. And what they were really being prosecuted was being sympathetic to Israel. I tried to go to Iran to observe the trial, and I actually asked the Iranian government for a visa, and I never got a response. So it's a very, I think when we're concerned about the Jews in Iran, I think we have to be concerned about Israel, we have to be concerned about the diaspora, but we also have to be concerned about those 8,000 who are, or 8,900 who are poorly put upon.
Thank you. And in terms, we've spoken about the sanctions and whether or not those sanctions are effective. On the diplomatic side, right now there are no diplomatic relations between Iran and Canada. normally, when we have diplomatic relations with a country, we have at least access to that country and access to information about what's going on. As you said, and as we've heard from previous testimony, what is being said and what is being done are two different things. We had historically the situation, for example, in where there was no diplomatic ties between China and the U.S. back during the Nixon era, yet there were backdoor discussions between Kissinger and various people during that period. Could you comment on whether there would be any value in beginning, or at least trying to open some sort of diplomatic contact with Iran, at least to be able to get more truer information as to what's happening with all the religious minorities and the ethnic minorities in Iran?
Sure. First of all, I mean, and I apologize, Mr. Chair, I didn't really properly introduce myself at the beginning, but I'm an immigration lawyer in Winnipeg, so I'm particularly sensitive to the fact that there's no embassy in Tehran, because that means there's no visa office in Tehran. And in Afghanistan, refugees who are in Iran, and there's a lot of them, have to deal now with the Canadian visa office in Ankara, Turkey, which is, and the Afghani refugees in Iran can't get into Turkey, so that's a very practical problem. But when you're talking about diplomatic relations or sanctions, I would say this is an issue that is more than just Canada. If Canada alone were imposing sanctions, they wouldn't have much an effect. And if Canada alone were dealing with Iran, also it wouldn't have much of an effect. I mean, Canada is not that important a player politically or economically or militarily in Iran in isolation. And so I think what we have to do in concert. And there are sanctions against Iran globally right now, and that's why they're working. It's not just because that's why they have an impact. It's not just because Canada's doing it. I don't think Canada should be breaking ranks. I think Canada should be joining in on that, and the same with the diplomatic relations. The diplomatic relations is a bit touchy because we broke off diplomatic relations at the time that we listed the Iran as a state under the Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist entity. And the part of the rhetoric of Iran is perverse mirror imaging. We accuse them of a human rights violation. They accuse us of human rights violations. I mean, obviously, there's nothing comparable, but in their distorted rhetoric, that's the way they deal with it. And the government, as I understood it, was concerned. We set up legislation that says they can be sued in Canada. They're just going to seize our assets in Iran on the same kind of perverse reciprocal basis. So I can see a logic in doing it. I know that many military establishments and security establishments sometimes have private back-channel communications with people with whom there's no official communications. And as an outsider in NGO, there's not a whole lot I can say about it. But I would say in terms of the official government policy, which is sanctions, no diplomatic relations, in context, even though it causes a lot of difficulty, including for people in my practice, I would say all the same, it makes sense.
We went a minute and a half over on that particular one. Ms. Graywell.
Thank you, Chair, and I would like to thank the witnesses for their testimony before the subcommittee this afternoon, and for their commitment in the struggle against injustice, human rights abuses, and anti-Semitism. In a region of the world with a troubling record on civil liberties and human rights, especially for women, girls, and minorities, Iran stands as a particularly egregious. A recent report by Dr. Ahmed Shahid, the UN Special Rapporteur, stated that there are at least 895 prisoners of conscience and political prisoners incarcerated in Iran. This includes political activists, religious minorities, civil activists, students, journalists, and other civil society leaders. So political prisoners, they face widespread physical and mental abuse. According to some human rights groups, Iranian authorities execute on average more than 2 people a day. Clearly, Canada must continue to speak out against these abuses. So, as you stated, Mr. Matas, that Hassan Rouhani has had no positive impact, and he is no better than Ahmadinejad. Iran's impact on human rights extends beyond its borders. ISIL, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, Hamas. So these are some of the most dangerous terrorist groups, and they all depend on the support of countries like Iran. I understand that there have been disagreements between Iran and Hamas and a corresponding decline in support. So that being said, did Iran provide support to Hamas in its recent war with Israel, and if so, in what manner?
Iran has been using Hamas for its anti-Israel agenda. Iran is Shiite, Hamas is Sunni. So that there is this kind of divide between them. Hamas suffered as a result of the last war. I mean, a lot of the infrastructure was destroyed. Iran has been, I would say, arming them and egging them on. Occasionally, Israel intercepts arms shipments from Iran to Hamas. Hamas has backed off recently because of it doesn't want to restart what it just went through, and Iran disagrees with that. I mean, Iran wants Hamas to keep on attacking Israel, so there is a bit of a drift that way. But this kind of drift obviously doesn't give me any sense of satisfaction with Iran. Quite the opposite. It says something about Iran. I mean, if you read the Charter of Hamas, you can't imagine anything more anti-Jewish, anti-Israeli. But it's not good enough for Iran. They want more. So I think that gives you an idea of the extent of the problem we're facing with Iran.
I see. Any one of you would like to comment on this?
You mentioned that in regards to the Iranian deaths that are 2 people a day approximately, and if you do the calculation properly, 730 people die annually. And I just want to let you know that I have a friend in Toronto that have actually experienced and saw one of these deaths. And I just wanted to mention to you that it's important that we're taking these steps. That's pretty much it. Thank you.
In Iran, official government discrimination against Jews has been pervasive and fostering a threatening atmosphere for the approximately 20 to 25,000 member Jewish community there. And over the years, top political and religious leaders made public remarks denying the Holocaust and calling for the elimination of the state of Israel. So has there been any increase in anti-Semitism, and why are Jews being targeted?
Well, first of all, in terms of the numbers, the numbers have sort of slowly decreased over the years. It started off, in 1948, there's a variety of estimates. We don't have an official census, but probably the best figure is from the Jewish Agency, which actually had an office in Tehran at the time, and they said between 100 and 120,000. It at one point went down to 25,000, which is the figure you mentioned, but there was a census in 2011, and it's 8,956. It was a very specific number. Now, that may be underreporting because some people may not want to identify as Jewish, but it's probably the best figure we've got right now, which is it indicates, and that's 4 years ago, so it's probably even less now. And there is anti-Semitism, but it melds with anti-Zionism. If you're prepared to denounce Israel and Zionism, you're maybe going to be left alone, or you'll be under a cloud of suspicion, but that's all. But I would say it has gotten worse because of the advent of the State of Israel, the anti-Zionism. I mean, there were some anti-Semitic problems in Iran before the advent of the State of Israel, just because of the pervasive influence of the Nazi ideology, which spread everywhere, including the Middle East. But it just assumed particular vehemence once the advent of the State of Israel occurred, and it went through stages. There was a problem in 1948, and there was the government of Mossadegh, which was anti-Semitic. He was replaced by the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran was not; his regime was not anti-Semitic, and the exodus more or less stopped. There was between 1948 and the time when the Shah came into power, which I think was the 50, was it 70s? The Shah of Iran came into power before that. But when the Shah came into power, there was about 70,000 people who'd left before he came into power, and then the exodus stopped because he was not anti-Zionist, he was not anti-Israel, he was treating the Jewish population properly, and people stayed, which I think itself is also an indication of what was going on there. And then in '79. When he was gone, by the time he left, during his period, there was about 80,000 people there, and after '79, it went from 80,000 to now about 9,000. Because this regime, I mean, even the regime of Mossadegh was bad, but it's certainly not as bad as the current regime. Because the current regime, the anti-Semitism, the anti-Zionism, isn't just a facet of the regime. I view it as central to its core ideology. I mean, this is why the regime is there. That's what it's about. And I mean, it's got obviously other facets.
I'm going to have to jump in here, or other people are going to lose their chance for a question. You're 2 minutes over again, sorry. But if you'd like to pick it up with the next question. Mr. Cotler, I understand, has a motion he'd like us to deal with.
Yes,
very briefly.
I'd like to, before I put my questions, I'd like to, if I can't deal with the motion now, I have an SO31. I may not even be able to listen to the answer after I put the question, because I've been told I have to be in the House. So you have the motion regarding imprisoned Saudi blogger Raif Badawi. I've spoken to representatives of the parties. I believe all in agreement, and I agree with what Mr. Sweet recommended to me, that just in the last paragraph, we make an amendment where it says call on the Government of Canada to use all available means, just to change that to continue to use all available means. I'm fine with that.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, because there's an
emergency. And we have consensus on the actual motion? As amended. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead with your question.
I appreciate, because of the urgency of the situation, Mr. Badawi. Now, I'll go to my questions, and I apologize if I have to run before the answers, because I must speak in the House. My colleague, David Sweet, I might begin, just refer to the 4-hour debate we held in the House on anti-Semitism. I want to commend my colleagues who participated from all parties in that debate, and just to mention that the House yesterday unanimously adopted a resolution condemning the alarming rise in anti-Semitism and calling on the government to continue to use and to make the combating of anti-Semitism a domestic and international priority. I think that resolution is the first that I know of any parliament anywhere that has been so expressive and specific in that regard. And the fact that it was unanimous is something that I think bears appreciation. To my question now, to Mr. Matas, you spoke about the language in the UN General Assembly, that it should be enhanced, referencing the Iranian incitement. As you know, the 21st century began with the Supreme Leader Khamenei saying that there can be no solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict without the annihilation of the Jewish state. And more recently, that language has continued with references to the excising of Israel as being a cancerous tumor in the Middle East. We don't have Ahmadinejad around anymore, but that language is not necessarily receded. My question to you is, the first question, and I'll put the second one, and then you can answer them both, is whether there are legal remedies that we can use to sanction the Iranian leadership for this state-sanctioned incitement to hate and to genocide, which is arguably a violation of the prohibition against incitement in the Genocide Convention? That's the first question. The second question has to do with the fact that tomorrow is the Global Day of Action for the Education is Not a Crime campaign, to dramatize the painful reality that education is a crime for the Baha'i community, who are effectively treated as non-citizens in Iran. Today, the largest but most persecuted minority in Iran. I thought I'd invite you, if you wanted, because I know this has been another area of your concern, if you might want to make a comment on that as another symbol of the Iranian domestic repression of human rights and religious freedom. So those are my two questions.
Okay, in terms of legal remedies, I mean, obviously there's no legal remedy in Iran. In terms of international remedies through the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court, there might be a remedy through the International Court of Justice through the Genocide Convention. If one state wants to bring Iran to the International Court of Justice under the Genocide Convention. Iran's not a state party to the International Criminal Court. In terms of Canada, there's potential universal jurisdiction, but we'd have to have legislation that grants that universal jurisdiction. Right now, we've got universal jurisdiction legislation, as I mentioned before, under the Justice for Prevention of Terrorism Act, which relates only to terrorism, so that it could potentially include incitement to terrorism, which is one of the offenses, and it is a civil remedy. We do have international criminal universal jurisdiction remedies, which include genocide and incitement to genocide. They require the consent of the Attorney General, and they require presence. Somebody would actually have to be here, or a Canadian victim, which we could potentially, I would say there are Canadian victims of this incitement to terrorism, and so we could potentially ask the Attorney General to prosecute for incitement to terrorism with consent. I think one thing that would be useful is simply getting, I mean, there are these international arrest warrants already through Interpol for a number of people in the Iranian regime because of the Amia bombing. And I think we should be urging that these people be turned over for prosecution, not to Canada, but to Argentina. And I think that would be a help in seeing international legal remedies work. In terms of your second question about the Baha'i, I mean, you know, you have to ask why is the regime anti-Semitic? Why is it anti-Zionist? And to a certain extent, the answer is the same as why it's anti-Baha'i. I mean, it's using this hatred as a vehicle for putting itself in power, keeping itself in power, whipping up hatred against others as a way of whipping up support for itself. And this is a standard, I would say, totalitarian tactic. I mean, these people couldn't get elected, so but they have to justify their power in some way. So this is the way they justify it, by saying, we're the enemy of the Jews, we're the enemy of Baha'i, we're the guardians of the faith of Islam or Shiism. And so I see that ideological connection here. I think it's always worthwhile when you're looking at these violators to look at the ideological foundations of their hatred. And I think what we see with Iran is an ideological foundation which ties together their anti-Baha'i attitudes and their anti-Semitic attitudes.
Thank you, Mr. Matus. I'll ask the committee to beg my note that I must rush.
Thank you, Mr. Cotler. Mr. Hillier.
Before I get into some questions, Mr. Sweet and just thought it might be good to call some attention to what we mean when we say what it takes to qualify as a political prisoner. There's a lot of political prisoners, and if that's just a word out there, it doesn't take much to qualify to become a political prisoner, does it? Who's getting thrown in jail as political prisoners?
Well, I know that Amnesty International has a definition of a prisoner of conscience, which is a person being detained only for his conscientiously held beliefs and not for any acts of violence. I think that's pretty straightforward. I mean,
I'm not talking about the UN definition, but what does it take to get the regime mad enough at you to say, we're going to throw you in jail? just your thought,
Well,
your conscience.
again, this is a concept you find in the Refugee Convention. A political prisoner is not somebody who has a political opinion. A political prisoner may be have no opinion or may actually support the regime, but as long as the regime perceives you're the enemy, and they throw you in jail because of that, it doesn't matter what personally you are, you become a political prisoner. Thank you.
I also wonder if you could help distinguish some terminology. First of all, by anti-Zionists, Zionism or a Zionist is used as an insult or a derogatory term. How is Zionism, how is that distinct from just being Jewish or how is anti-Zionist distinct from being anti-Semitic? And is there a difference between being a Zionist and being pro-Israel?
Well, let me show you. You could say something. Well, why don't we let somebody else start?
You know, it's an interesting phenomenon. Anti-Semitism in the classical sense has shifted over the years. I mean, when you're talking about times from Nazi Germany, they could go around the streets and say, "We hate Jews." In the modern sense, we simply don't see this anymore. On Canadian campuses, which have become very, very uncomfortable for Jewish students on many university campuses across this country, you don't typically hear the rhetoric, you know, "I hate Jews" or "Jew this." You hear, "I hate Israel." And all of the classical attributes of anti-Semitism you have applying rather than to the usual individual, as in the past, and at the time of the Holocaust there was no state of Israel. That's all being placed onto the state of Israel today. So they'll say, "I hate Zionists." And feeling that even if it was only just a political expression, you know, it still is obviously discrimination. The vast majority, I mean the vast majority, I would say everybody within mainstream Judaism views themselves as a Zionist. There's a historical connection, there's a religious connection. This is something that Jews, you know, pray for to Zion and Jerusalem every day. It's an essential part. And but that's where things sort of shifted over time, and you had Zionism, resolutions at the United Nations, but that's essentially what has happened. That flip has happened. So it's an attack on Israel, and they say, well, we have problems with Israel's policy. But the lie to that is essentially when they say, well, you're a Jew, so clearly you must be a supporter of Israel. So clearly I'm going to be discriminating against you because I'm inferring those views upon you. Well, that essentially speaks for itself, and that's why it essentially is the same thing. It's anti-Semitism and it's Jew hatred. It's just a more polite expression of it in civil society today.
Yeah, I could give maybe a legal distinction that anti-Semitism is a set of human rights violations, a wide variety of forms of discrimination against the Jewish community. Anti-Zionism is the rejection of one particular Jewish right, the right to self-determination of peoples. There is a difference between anti-Zionism and being anti-Israel, because, you can be critical of, let's say, if you hate the way the roads are paved in Israel, so you're critical of Israel, but that's not being anti-Zionist. Anti-Zionism goes to the existence of the state of Israel rather than to its behavior.
Sure. Okay. So the official policy of the Iranian regime is not anti-Semitic but anti-Zionist, is that correct?
Well, it's I would say anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism. It's a very particular. So I would say, but of course, what Michael says is true. Once you're Jewish, you're suspected of being Zionist. So the anti-Zionists impose a wide range of violations on Jews as suspected anti-Zionists, perceived anti-Zionists, complicit in the crimes of Zionism, whether that's real or not.
And just briefly to add, the actions of the actual state of Iran, when they are targeting Jews for murder abroad through its terrorist proxies, that again is, well, it's the Zionist entity. No, these are innocents, and whether it's Jews or non-Jews that get murdered, that's the putting into action the rhetoric that's coming from this regime.
Thank you, Mr. Hillier. We're actually, in order to extend further, we're going to need permission of the committee. Mr. Benskin has a right to another question since I'm in the chair. Oh, so you pass? Okay, well, that would conclude. Yes.
A point that Mr. Hillier was trying to make, and if I could have 60 seconds, that would be. Our question kind of went awry a bit, but what I wanted to get on the record, gentlemen, was just that you don't have to. There's a very narrow caste that you have to live within as far as a lifestyle in Iran in order to stay out of jail. Simply by being a Baha'i person and loving people and telling people that you're Baha'i, you can be incarcerated in Iran. Simply by being a Jew, you can be incarcerated in Iran. Simply by putting one entry in a blog that is slightly askew of what this regime believes. See, and the point I'm trying to make is that we always refer to them as political prisoners, but these folks who are jailed and tortured in Iran are often guilty of so little, like Pastor Abedini, for example, who I've been advocating for years, who simply was a pastor at home churches and has been incarcerated since 2012. So that was the point that we're trying to make, and I just wonder if you agree with that.
Yes, sure, which to a certain extent relates to the previous comment that had been made. When we're dealing with political prisoners, they're not political in our sense, they're just seen as political by the regime. I just wanted to say, by way of concluding comment, that I'm pleased that the committee has given us this opportunity and that they have put Iran on their agenda. But I would encourage the committee as well to do a report on the issue, because there's a number of factual, legal policy issues that arise when you're dealing with Iran, and I believe we would all benefit from the wisdom of the committee on this.
Well, thank you. We're at the point of adjournment. I want to thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I noticed Mr. Mostyn's name is very close to Marston when you pronounce it. I'll have to start checking my own history very quickly now. Anyway, thank you for your testimony. And we, the clerk or an analyst has noted your request at the end of the meeting. I noted that out of the corner of my eye, so I'm sure we'll be discussing that. Thank you very much, and we stand adjourned.